Aloha and welcome to Vice Cubes. I'm your host, Raven Aiko. Today I'll be discussing the case of the Honolulu Strangler. This is Hawaii's first known serial killer. He is thought to be responsible for 5 murders on the island of Oahu between 1985 and 1986. I really personally dislike unsolved murders. I feel like I need the closure. So I don't know if you guys like unsolved or don't like unsolved. I kind of don't. But I also feel that it is important to shine a light on them just in case someone has any information and wants to come forward. So here we go. And as always, listener discretion is advised. So the victims. Vicki Gail Purdy. Vicki was 25 years old at the time of her death. She was married to Gary Purdy, an Army helicopter pilot. Vicki had plans to go out clubbing with her girlfriends on the evening of May 29th, 1985. Her husband expected her home at around 9 p.m. So apparently this was not uncommon for her to go out with her friends without her husband. She's done that quite a bit. So it wasn't like a weird thing for her. But according to her friends, she never showed up. She never made it back home either that night. Her husband expected her home at around 9 p.m. She never showed up, so he just continuously paged her at the time. This was before cell phones, so it was pagers. He was paging her, got no answer. Her body was found the following day on an embankment at Ke'ehi Lagoon. Her hands were bound behind her back. She had been raped and strangled. The last person to have seen her alive was a taxi driver who drove her to the Shorebird Hotel at around midnight to retrieve her car, which was located there. So Vicki worked at a video rental store where a year earlier, 2 women had been stabbed to death. Police investigated this lead, thinking that maybe it was related, but apparently there was no connection there. The Honolulu Strangler's second victim is Regina Sakamoto, and Regina was just 17 years old at the time of her death. She attended Lelehua High School, and on the morning of January 14th, 1986, Regina missed her bus to school. She called her boyfriend at about 7:15 in the morning to let him know that she was going to be late, but she never showed up. Her body was found the next day, also at Ke'ehi Lagoon, and she was naked from the waist down. Her hands were bound behind her back, and she had been raped and strangled. The Honolulu Strangler's third victim was Denise Hughes. Denise was 21 years old at the time of her death. She was employed as a secretary at a telephone company. She did not show up for work, and her body was found by 3 fishermen on February 1st, 1986. She was already, at that point, badly decomposed. She was wrapped in a blue tarp. Her hands were bound behind her back, and she had been strangled. The Honolulu Strangler's fourth victim was Louise Medeiros. Louise was 25 years old at the time of her death. She resided on the island of Oahu at Waipahu, but on this particular time, she took a trip to Kauai to visit her family. She flew back to Oahu on a late flight on the night of March 26, 1986, and she told her family that they didn't need to worry about picking her up from the airport because she'd just catch a bus home. Well, she never made it home that night, and her decomposing body was found on April 2nd, 1986, near Waikele Stream. She was naked from the waist down, and her hands were bound behind her back. She was sexually assaulted and strangled. The Honolulu Strangler's fifth and final victim was Linda Pesci. Linda was 36 years old at the time of her death. Linda lived with a roommate who last seen her on April 29, 1986. She didn't return home from work that night. And then after being told that Linda had not shown up for work the following morning, the roommate reported her missing. They found her car on the side of the Nimitz H1 viaduct. This one's kind of weird because a man named Howard Gay took police to an area on Sand Island, a location where he said that a psychic had told him that her body could be found. Her body was not at that location, but after continued searching, the police did find her on Sand Island, just in a different area. And she was naked. Her hands were bound behind her back. So those are the victims of the Honolulu Strangler. You'll notice they range in ages from 17 to 36. All of them had their hands bound behind their back. Most of them had been sexually assaulted. So after the two murders, the Hawaii Police Department detectives were convinced that the murders were related since the modus operandi for both were the same and the dumping ground of the bodies was the same. Following the discovery of the third body, the police department's Criminal Investigative Division, with assistance from the FBI and the Green River Task Force, formed a serial killer task force comprised of 27 persons. At this time, Oahu had attracted thousands of migrant workers. There was also a large military population on the island's bases. And between 1985 and 1986, there are said to have been over 10 million visitors to Hawaii. So as you can imagine, this makes it very difficult for them to narrow down, where the killer may have come from. The police department's profile of the killer was that he was an opportunist who attacked women who frequented vulnerable spots like bus stops. The killer did not stalk his victims before killing them, and given the location of the dumping sites, investigators theorized that he lived somewhere in the vicinity of Waipahu or Sand Island. After the fourth body was found, HPD began using female undercover officers in kind of a sting operation. They placed them near the airports and Ke'ehi Lagoon with no luck. After the fifth murder, police set up roadblocks all over the city. They would stop citizens and question them about the string of murders. There was an arrest on May 9th, 1986. It was the unnamed informant who led police to Pesci's corpse. Police interviewed the suspect's girlfriend and his ex-wife, who told police that he was interested in sexual bondage. His ex-wife also said that he often tied her hands behind her back during sex. He failed a polygraph examination, which, of course, we all know is not admissible in a court of law, and HPD let him go. 2 months after the arrest, the suspect was identified in a lineup by a witness who said she saw Pesci with her killer on the night of April 29, 1986. That witness, however, refused to cooperate further because she was afraid. She said that the suspect had seen her that night as well. So she didn't want him to know that it was her that told. She was afraid for her life. The suspect, who is unnamed, died in 2005. So justice has never been served for these 5 women, and I wonder if DNA testing had been available back in the 80s, if that would have led to an arrest and conviction and justice. There have been other unsolved murders on the island of Oahu. I think the murder of Lisa Au would be one of them, and that happened in 1982. That I've heard hinted that it might also have been the Honolulu Strangler, but she wasn't linked to him definitively. So serial killers, let's talk about them. The FBI defines serial killer as someone who commits at least 3 murders over more than a month with an emotional cooling off period in between. The National Institute of Justice defines serial killer as involving committing 2 or more murders with a psychological motive and sadistic sexual overtones. Personally, I don't think that either of these definitions are 100% correct. There have been many studies on this subject that have been done over the years, and with everything else, there are exceptions to each rule. And my interest in serial killers came from reading the Monster books by Robert K. Ressler. Robert Ressler was an FBI agent for well over 20 years. He's credited with helping to develop psychological profiling of criminals. He wrote books. The books that he wrote were called Whoever Fights Monsters. He wrote that in 1992. And I Have Lived in the Monster. He wrote that in 1997. Ressler has extensively interviewed notorious serial killers such as Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Edmund Kemper, Jeffrey Dahmer, and the Son of Sam. He also, interestingly, advised Thomas Harris on The Silence of the Lambs, which is also one of my favorite books and movies. So Ressler's monster books, which I read in college, were my first glimpse into the minds of serial killers, and I was hooked ever since. I'm fascinated with not necessarily the crimes, but with the psychological aspect behind the crimes. You know, like, how can a mind become this? Or maybe even, what are their vices? So it's really interesting, you know. The stories are all so different. You know, like when you think about Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, you know, there's something called victimology where you can kind of, you know, link their victims to being a similar type or a similar age or a similar, you know, they look very similar. And that's also, you know, part of the criminal profiling, which is very interesting to me. And a lot of the serial killers, you know, they do, their crimes do have sexual undertones. Either they're actually raping their victims, or they're getting some kind of sadistic pleasure from it. Jeffrey Dahmer, as we all know, was not only a serial killer and a rapist, but he was also a cannibal. And I believe that, you know, at this time we are learning that that's not such an uncommon thing as well. Yeah, there's a lot more that I can say about that, and I probably will go into that more in a future episode. So again, thank you everyone for listening. If you have any information about the Honolulu Strangler, anything at all, or any one of the unsolved murders that I've mentioned here, or any unsolved murders, you know, that you know of on Oahu or any of the islands, please don't hesitate to call the Hawaii Police Department and, you know, tell them what you know. As I always said, someone knows something, someone's seen something, someone knows someone who saw something. So thanks for listening, everyone, and until next time, be safe.